Welcome to Not Suitable for Democracy, the show about the problems facing American democracy and sometimes how to solve them with organizing. I'm your host, Nick, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about queer and trans rights, what Zohar Mamdani did right here in New York City this past Friday, what also happened in Idaho this past week, and how will trans rights shape the Democratic primary in 2028. We have a lot to discuss, so let's get into it. Breaking news, we just hit 150 subscribers on YouTube. Now, this has been a slow and steady climb, but we are so grateful for all of the support. Thank you so much for every subscriber. And if you're following along on YouTube, make sure to subscribe, give us a like and a comment, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Or if you're following along on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, tuning in, make sure to leave a review, give 5 stars, and you'll be the first to know when you subscribe when new episodes are out. Thank you so much for the support. Now, back to the show. First, we look back at what happened in Idaho this past Tuesday. Now, believe it or not, same-sex marriage hasn't been on the forefront as much as trans rights has been in the center of political debate. Now, this is mainly because we know that same-sex marriage recently had a ruling struck down by the Supreme Court about revisiting a potential case. So, lo and behold, we covered that right here on Not Suitable for Democracy, where our prediction was correct. We knew that the court would not uphold or hear the case from Kim Davis, who was citing a very weak legal argument. And we're so happy to have our supporters reach out and really have that conversation about how we can advance the movement and be informed of queer and gay and trans rights. So, lo and behold, what happened on Tuesday, March 10th? Well, the Idaho State House, their state legislature, they had voted for a resolution, which is different than a bill. But the resolution is basically a non-binding statement, which they kind of reasserts their intention for what they wish to do. So in this case, this resolution was actually going to be a request to the Supreme Court to revisit their same-sex marriage ruling with Obergefell versus Hodges. Now, we know that's been settled over 10 years ago at this point, so no need to revisit that ruling. Now, of course, we know that Idaho is a very conservative state. They are one of the most conservative out there, but also them being more in a rural area, we know their GDP is far lower than what we see in California or New York, right? A typical red state. The catch, though, is that now that this group is, very much aligned with the MAGA agenda, President Trump, but really trying to move the needle and in a horrible direction, obviously, to challenge the notion of same-sex marriage and, its legality, which would essentially, send the message that the LGBTQIA plus community is not dignified. That is unacceptable for 2026. So the fact that we still have to fight this means a lot. So, lo and behold, we know that it only passed in the state legislature in the House. The vote was 44-26. Clearly not a good margin, but we do know that it's a majority conservative and Republican legislature between their state house and their governor, right? And the representation to Congress and the representation to the Senate. So we know who we're dealing with. But because of that, right, we also know that the Idaho State Senate is not going to be picking up this bill. They already know that this would be, political suicide to an extent, right? In 2026, to waste time on a non-binding resolution, meanwhile, it doesn't move any legislation or any policy, and it really starts making a whole spectacle to the Supreme Court, which again, not only did they strike down the Kim Davis case, but this would just put conservatives on another path to just, reaffirm, we will not be taking up your case. This is settled matter, settled discourse. There's no need for this. It would be embarrassing for them if they were to actually proceed, as much as it'd be just as horribly undignified and just a gross, outward display of homophobia, transphobia, queerphobia, right? There's absolutely no need for it. So, fortunately, Idaho State Senate, they will not be voting for it, and I'm sure the governor would veto it anyway. Because they don't want to open up that can of worms when, as we know, the current president or occupant of the White House has very low approval ratings. We know that right now he's not doing so well in terms of what's happening overseas in the Middle East. We know things are not going well in terms of the special elections that have been happening and the primaries most recently, where Republicans have been losing. One quick other fact here in Florida, in Boca Raton, which is a predominantly conservative area, which we know everyone goes there when they retire down there, and that's their place, right? So Boca Raton, just for the first time ever, on Friday, they had just had a Democrat win the seat for mayor. Mayor of Boca Raton, the first time a Democrat won that seat in 30 years. 3 decades, everybody. 3 decades they've not had a Democrat win. But guess how many votes he won by? 1 vote. That's all it takes. So congratulations to Andy Thomson. He is the Democrat who won the seat the first time in 30 years, let alone by 1 vote. Now, of course, that margin is super tiny, and it would obviously call into question a recount. So, lo and behold, there was a recount shortly after the election results. And what did they find next? That Andy Thomson actually won by 5 votes. His margin of victory actually increased. So, can you believe that the recount actually benefited him? Now, let's be clear on this context. This was not a one-on-one matchup. The race did have 2 Republicans, okay, and one Democrat who won. So the point here is that if you look at the vote totals between the 3 candidates, you had Andy Thomson with the winning number, I think it was 7,568, versus second place, 7,567, and then the remaining candidate had just over 3,000 votes. But if you add up the conservative votes, right, 7,000 for one candidate, 3,000 for the other, well, that's 10,000 Republican votes. So when you look at the Democrat who got 7,000, the Republicans could have won. The Republicans could have won that race. But lo and behold, they had a spoiler candidate, right? Also, it split the vote, not even like half, not really 50-50, but like it was just enough where it really did prevent the other Republican from winning the seat. So at the end of the day, this just goes to show every vote counts. Please make sure you are participating in every election, your primary elections, your special elections, and your general elections. Anything to make your voice heard, because that is suitable for democracy.